Hi everyone, welcome to today's TRI lecture of Ancient Philosophies Part 1. My name is Jonathan Chen and I'll be your speaker today. So our journey begins right here today in the Greek agora, also meaning as meeting place in Greek. So these agoras usually existed around 600 BC, and every single Greek city had one where it was extremely accessible to all types of people. People would buy stuff there, people would talk about things there. It's just a place where everybody would go to. So if you're in Taipei, Tianmu or Taipei 101 would be like an agora. Now you would think that people would just hang around supermarkets all day or actually some type of losers, but you would be surprised to think that in the old ages, these type of losers were people like Socrates or Plato or some mathematical genius like Aristotle. All of these people, the agora gave them a platform to be talking about and be communicating and creating discourse upon important ideas and ideological advances, which fostered multiple developments that we know today. So let's start talking about the first philosopher. This man is called Socrates. He lived from around 469 to 399 BCE. Now, he's a pretty funny looking man, but I forgot my script. He was an extremely important philosopher. People call him the founder of philosophy. And I know you might have known his name because of Socratic methods or Socratic seminars you may have had in your school, but please bear with me. I promise that it's not what representative of what Socrates really was about and what his ideas proposed for. So Socrates once said that the wise man is the man who knows that he knows nothing, and it's a pretty interesting ideology, but it's exactly how Socrates lived his life. Instead of just going around being like that stupid dude who just goes around lecturing his ideas and making people listen to him, Socrates spent most of the time just talking to people and trying to test out people's validity of their arguments, but also challenging what people said. Which is also why Socrates doesn't really have any writings left behind, but instead most of what we know from his philosophies are instead from his disciples and most importantly, Plato. So you have this dude just roaming around supermarkets all day, challenging people to debates and trying to prove people wrong. That's honestly pretty annoying, and it's also pretty ironic considering that Socrates later was voted guilty of corrupting the youth, but also not acknowledging the gods, which was overall, when the Greek people took a vote, he was voted to be killed, and then that's how he died. I mean, it's also pretty crazy to just think that some random dude in a supermarket is now deemed as one of the most influential person of all time. Can you imagine someone in your supermarket just getting you to buy peaches, and suddenly in a few centuries he just becomes like a world-renowned philosopher? So what's really significant about Socrates? First, we have here the Socratic method. I know it's probably not very popular because it just becomes the kids who like to talk just starts dominating the conversation, but the whole core value of the Socratic method is so that people can throw out ideas and also it can be evaluated equally by everyone. Honestly, whether you like it or not, it's pretty constructive considering the fact that it's transparent, but also everybody gets a say and gets an opportunity to talk about. Now, obviously, it can also just turn into chaos, but if you have people who can respect order and respect others who are talking in the room, Socratic methods and Socratic seminars can usually be sometimes the most effective way to come up with a solution or to have a discussion. Second, there's a reason as to why Socrates was called the father of Western philosophy. As Cicero said, Socrates brought down philosophy from the skies. And this included the fact that Socrates literally spent his entire life challenging different things and making people think. Which is also why disruptors, societal disruptors more specifically, are so crucial in society because they make people realize different things and also change for the better. For example, past intellectual movements such as the Enlightenment was caused by the 30 Years' War, and the next intellectual movement was also caused by people who brought up new ideas, for example, Socrates, and later who will introduce Plato. Lastly, Socrates was a big believer that philosophy was a big part of life and it should affect all of our life, our decisions, our ethics, and our morals. But unlike other philosophers or ideologists that we have talked about, for example, the Buddha or Lao Tzu, you would find the difference that exists within Socrates and within mainly Western philosophy is that Socrates and other Western philosophers will center around their philosophy to the sense of government or politics. For example, one of the philosophies or analogies Socrates came up with to challenge people's thinking is when he challenged the idea of democracy. He said, when you're sailing off to a ship to a really long trip, who would you want as a captain? Would you want a sailor with professional experience, or would you want some few randos that you pull off the street? It's also pretty ironic, and the irony still exists from our last slide, that Socrates was actually killed off by a few randos, but this critique of democracy does raise a few concerns. However, a few point that you need to consider that when we limit voting and participation to only the educated, then we would fall back to a society where the upper class controlled everything. Damn, you see what I did there? It's called the Socratic method. Now, this other philosopher is called Plato. He was actually a student of Socrates. Most of what we know from Socrates comes from Plato's writings, and Plato was also an extremely gifted writer, so a lot of what we know from Western philosophy actually comes from Plato's writings. So Plato was the founder of Platonic philosophy, which is a school that focused more on abstract sides of society and tried to relate that to real-life objects. But also more importantly, Plato is also considered as the father of political philosophy, meaning that he had a lot of writings, for example, The Republic, which is one of his most famous books that talks about how republic and our government should be ran. Plato is also sometimes considered as one of the first philosophy teachers because unlike his annoying master, Socrates, he didn't get killed off by annoying people too much. Plato's actually got to open his own academy, which is literally called the Academy, where he got to lecture philosophies, and that academy actually lasted more than 2 centuries. So Plato arguably outshined his master, Socrates, but why is he so important? So one of Plato's greatest achievements, as we just mentioned in the last slide, is the Academy, which was a school Plato created where it would just teach philosophical teachings, hoping to create people who would do well in the government or do well for society. Now, something else really important to notice is that in the Academy, Plato actually didn't take any tuition, meaning that he spread knowledge pretty much for free. It's really important that education is offered so that as a civilization, people can be successful, and Plato lived true to every single word like that. But damn, can you imagine Bushibans living for that long, 2 centuries? I would not live through that. And second to none, Plato brought up this ideal of the Platonic love, which was one of the main ideas you can find in his writings, the Symposium. He constructs a conversation where he creates an idea of the ladder of love, meaning the steps of attraction and then the steps taken to achieve a true relationship. Now, obviously, the first step of that ladder comes physical attraction because humans are animals at the end of the day. We're still attracted to physical beings. Then as we advance upon the ladder, you would see that after people being physically attracted, they will be spiritually attracted, meaning that attracted to their partner's beliefs. And then at the end of the day, at the end of the ladder comes intellectual attraction, meaning that people are attracted because of their partner's intellectual capacity. Now, this is really important because this means that platonic relationships introduced an idea that you can be in a relationship that's non-intimate, or in other words, non-sexual. Now, don't get too excited there. We're still, at the end of the day, talking about platonic love, and platonic love can apply to romantic relationships, but most of the time it is not. Now, it's one of the most important concepts that Plato came up with, but it's this idea of the philosopher king. Now, we talked about how Plato is the father of political philosophy, and the philosopher king is what he deemed as the best ruling form. Now, I know that philosophers sound like geeks and like nerds and all that stuff, but bear with me here, trust me, that is not what he's saying. Plato's idea of a philosopher king actually surrounds the fact that a ruler must rule with intelligence, a love for wisdom, as well as a will to live a simple life. It's important, as he said, combined with his ideas of education and some influences you can see from his master Socrates, he agreed that a ruler must be educated and must be humble in order to become a good ruler and rule a successful country. Now, have we ever really seen this philosopher king concept come true or manifest? Well, it's pretty hard to say because in history there's been proven that a lot of idiots have managed to get hold of countries or empires and they became rulers themselves. But actually there's been a pretty prominent example of a philosopher king, and that is Marcus Aurelius, who was deemed as the last great Roman emperor, but also he was the founder of a whole new school of philosophy called Stoicism. He's also one of my personal heroes, so I'm looking forward to do a video about him one day. Trust me, I'm not gonna put him with another philosopher for a series. Last but not least comes the Republic. The Republic isn't a set of ideals or concepts, but instead it's a series of books left behind by Plato. Inside the book, Plato mainly talks about political philosophy, but he also touches into a lot of aspects of life. What makes the Republic a really interesting book is that it doesn't just outright tell you its philosophies, but instead, through the different interaction of characters and conversations inside the Republic, you can see a lot of different power dynamics, and a lot of ideals actually come from the interactions instead of the words being said. I've flipped through it a few times, and I would rate it 10/10, definitely would recommend. In some ways, there are a lot of different methods you can connect from Socrates and Plato's philosophies into the East, but most of them will have to center around this idea of education and challenging ideas. For Socrates, an instant connection that I made would be Confucius. Both of them love to talk. Literally, Confucius' disciples will just walk around with him all day and just talk with him. And a funny connection between those two is that both Socrates and Confucius didn't actually write down things that we read today, but instead their disciples, for example, Plato and Confucius' disciples, actually wrote down the things that they say and made them into teachings. Another connection you can make is actually between Confucius and Plato. Both Confucius and Plato started their own schools specifying on philosophical teachings, and another interesting connection you can make is that both of them didn't take much for tuition fees. Plato just made his education completely free, whereas Confucius just took strings of meat. Also, there's another pretty funny connection that I didn't put on the slideshow, but this idea of platonic love and the Eastern stereotype of, oh, you can't date until college. If you think from that perspective, maybe it's good that you don't date until college because you've matured up the ladder of love and you're more attracted to people's spiritual and intellectual sense, but whoever you want to be attracted to, that's your business. Good luck. Last but not least, one of the interesting connections that I also made was between this philosopher king and this education within the state inside Eastern society. Now, we would know that in Chinese society, it was more of a hereditary monarchy rule system, as in the king died and his son became the king. So obviously we can't relate the philosopher king because eventually you're gonna get a son that's like an idiot. But you can connect this idea of the philosopher king with the civil examination exams. Now, if we know that it's an idea brought up by Confucius where officials have to be fluent or at least knowledgeable in senses of philosophy or in just basic intellectualism, and only officials that are educated should be taking positions. Now, it's pretty easy to argue against the type of system because it is in some sense elitist that some people cannot get access to education, but from this perspective, you can see the core value of both what Plato and Socrates, as well as Confucius and other Eastern philosophers, tried to argue for, that education is the core root of society, and without education, a civilization cannot succeed. Thank you for attending today's lecture, and we hope to see you in future videos.